At 9:34 p.m. on July 13, 1977, New York City was glowing like it always did. Millions of lights stretched across the skyline. Apartment windows, street lamps, subway stations, billboards. The city looked alive. Then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. Across the entire skyline, the lights started going out. One building, then another. Within minutes, the largest city in the United States was completely dark. Most people didn't know it yet, but a chain reaction had already begun more than 30 miles north of the city. Earlier that evening, a violent summer thunderstorm had rolled across the Hudson Valley. Lightning struck a transmission line owned by Consolidated Edison, the power company responsible for supplying electricity to New York City. Normally, a single lightning strike isn't enough to shut down a power grid. Power systems are designed with protections, backup lines, automatic shutoffs. But that night, several small failures stacked on top of each other, and the system began to unravel. The first lightning strike hit a major transmission line near Buchanan, New York. Protective equipment should have isolated the damage instantly. Instead, a key circuit breaker failed to operate. That meant electricity kept flowing through a damaged line. Operators at the control center were now racing against the clock. They began shifting power to other transmission lines. But then the storm delivered another lightning strike. And then another. Each strike knocked out more parts of the grid. Power that once flowed through many lines was now being forced through fewer and fewer pathways. The system was becoming overloaded. Inside the control room, operators watched alarms start lighting up across their panels. Lines tripping offline, voltage levels dropping, power plants struggling to balance the load. At this point, the blackout could still have been prevented. But several critical mistakes were made. One of the biggest problems was communication. The computer system that monitored the grid was already under heavy strain. Some alarms were delayed, others didn't display correctly. Operators were trying to manage a rapidly changing situation with incomplete information. And the storm wasn't done yet. Another lightning strike hit a major transmission corridor. That line dropped offline too. Now the power flowing into New York City had been drastically reduced. Meanwhile, demand inside the city was still enormous. It was a hot summer night. Air conditioners were running everywhere. Subways were packed with commuters heading home. The electrical grid was under massive stress, and the remaining transmission lines began to overload. At 9:27 p.m., one of the last major lines feeding power into New York City tripped offline. The grid operators attempted to bring backup generation online. But by then, the imbalance was too severe. Electric systems must stay perfectly balanced. If generation and demand drift too far apart, the entire network becomes unstable. Within minutes, the frequency of the system began dropping. That's when the cascade started. One power plant shut down to protect itself, then another, then another. At 9:34 p.m., the final generators supplying the city disconnected. And just like that, New York City went dark. Inside apartment buildings, elevators stopped between floors. Thousands of people were trapped. Subway trains screeched to a halt inside tunnels. Passengers suddenly found themselves sitting in complete darkness underground. Traffic lights died across every borough. Cars stalled in intersections. Police radios lit up with calls within minutes. At first, most people assumed the outage would last maybe an hour. That's what usually happened. But this time, something felt different. The entire skyline was dark. Not just a few blocks, the whole city. And then something else began happening. In some neighborhoods, crowds started gathering outside. Store owners rushed to close their gates. Because during the late 1970s, New York was already struggling. Crime rates were high. The city was still recovering from a financial crisis. Tensions were already simmering beneath the surface. And darkness changed the atmosphere almost instantly. Within an hour, looting began. Storefront windows were smashed. Electronics stores were hit first, then clothing stores, then grocery stores. In Brooklyn and the Bronx, entire blocks were stripped bare. Police officers were overwhelmed. Emergency calls poured in faster than dispatchers could handle. Firefighters raced from building to building as fires started breaking out. More than 1,000 fires would burn across the city that night. The blackout had turned into a full-scale crisis. Meanwhile, city officials were trying to understand what had gone wrong. Why had the entire power grid collapsed? Investigators would later discover that the blackout wasn't caused by just one problem. It was a chain of failures. Lightning strikes triggered the initial damage, but the real issue was the system's lack of resilience. Several protective devices had malfunctioned, some equipment had not been properly upgraded, and the control room lacked modern monitoring tools. In other words, the system was fragile. One strong storm was enough to push it over the edge. The blackout lasted 25 hours. By the time power was restored the next day, more than 1,600 stores had been looted. Over 1,000 fires had been set. Nearly 4,000 people were arrested. Entire neighborhoods were left devastated. For many New Yorkers, the night of the blackout became a defining memory of the 1970s. But the most important question isn't just what happened. It's how it could have been prevented. Because the truth is, most blackouts aren't caused by a single disaster. They happen when small vulnerabilities pile up. And in 1977, the power grid had several weaknesses. First, equipment upgrades had been delayed. Some protective systems were outdated. Modern grids use automated isolation systems that react in milliseconds. But in the 1970s, many of those systems simply didn't exist yet. Second, the monitoring technology inside the control center was limited. Operators were relying on computers that lacked real-time visualization. Today, grid operators use advanced software that can simulate system conditions instantly. Back then, decisions had to be made with partial data. Third, there was no strong system for cascading failure protection. Once the grid started destabilizing, there were few mechanisms to slow the collapse. Modern electrical grids are designed to break into smaller segments during emergencies. That prevents a failure in one region from shutting down an entire city. But in 1977, the system wasn't designed that way. After the blackout, major changes were made. Utilities invested heavily in stronger grid protections. New monitoring systems were developed. Operators were trained to detect instability much earlier, and backup generation capacity was expanded. The goal was simple: never let a single storm shut down the entire city again. But even today, the lessons from that night still matter. Power grids are incredibly complex machines. They depend on thousands of components working perfectly together. And when just a few things go wrong at the same time, the results can cascade faster than anyone expects. The blackout of 1977 proved something many people had never considered before. Even the largest city in America could go dark in minutes. All it took was a few lightning strikes and a system that wasn't ready for them.